So continuing then with the myth of the Volsunga saga, most of the Siegfried mythos is recounted in the Volsunga saga and in the Poetic Eddas, from where all this is coming from, and in the Nibelungenlied, and in the Thidreks saga, which is an Icelandic text. So to continue now, Gudhorm and Sigurd have slain each other. Brynhild at first finds out about it and at first laughs when she hears Gudrun sobbing. She laughs scornfully, and then she realizes, I guess, the gravity of the situation and what's happened, and she decides to kill herself. So she stabs herself and throws herself onto Sigurd's funeral pyre, and so she is burned up alive into the funeral pyre, and both Brynhild and Sigurd then are dead, done, and gone by that point. Gudrun, meanwhile, is in a state of grief, and she realizes what her brothers have done. She is married off to King Atli, who is actually Attila the Hun, largely once again due to machinations on the part of her mother Grimhild. Marries her off to Atli, so she is married to Atli, has some children by him, and then Atli one day decides he wants the gold, the famous Nibelung gold hoard that she knows the brothers Gunnar and Hogni are still in possession of. So he sends a messenger to them one day to invite them to a feast where he will slay them and take possession of the gold. And they know this. The brothers know this is going to happen, but it would be cowardice for them to refuse the invitation, so they decide to go anyway. So Gunnar and Hogni then travel to the kingdom of the Huns, where they meet Atli, and there's a conflict. They fight together. Gunnar is killed. Hogni is killed. Hogni has his heart ripped out of his chest. Gunnar is thrown into a snake pit. Gudrun throws him a harp, which he for some reason plays with his toes, which enchant all the snakes to sleep except one of them, who bites his heart and kills him. And so that's the end of her brothers. So she has taken vengeance on her brothers at this point, but then now she takes vengeance on King Atli by killing her two sons by him and serving him their flesh at night during the funeral celebration of the brothers. Serves him goblets, cups made from their skulls and their hearts that have been roasted. She's mixed up a nice concoction, mixed them together, and he's eaten his sons. He finds out about it, turns pale, goes to his room, where she stabs him then in the room, and then burns down Atli's house, burns down the whole hall. And then she herself escapes and tries to commit suicide by throwing herself into the ocean. She does so, but the waves wash her up ashore to another king, King Yannikr, whom she marries. So this is her third husband now. She marries King Yannikr and has two kids by him. He already has a son named Erp, Hamdil and Sorli. And then she has the daughter still from Sigurd, Svanhild. Svanhild gets into a kind of date rape situation where she is betrothed to a king named Jormunrek. She's going to marry Jormunrek, but Jormunrek's son Ranver either rapes her or there's a consensual sexual intercourse that takes place. But the king finds out about it, and he has his son hung, and the daughter, his stepdaughter Svanhild, is trampled to death by horses. And Gudrun, of course, wants vengeance for this, so she has her two sons, Hemdismal and Sorli. They kill Erp, the stepbrother, and then they kill the king by cutting off his hands and feet. And then he orders to have them stoned to death. And then so once again, everything ends up in a conflagration. Gudrun kills herself finally successfully by throwing herself into the ocean. And so she has a death by water, which is a mirror image of Brynhild's death by fire. That's not an accident. We have with Brynhild and Gudrun then, in this myth cycle, the pair of goddesses. It's an old motif in which one is associated with the watery abyss of the underworld and the other is associated with the heavens. The most ancient version of this is probably Inanna and her sister Ereshkigal. Inanna is the goddess of the morning star, Venus. She has heavenly associations, whereas her sister Ereshkigal is the mistress of the underworld. With Isis and Nephthys, we have Isis, who is associated with the throne in the upper world, and Nephthys, her symbol is a cup of water, which is symbolic of the watery abyss of the underworld, and so forth and so on. And so Brynhild and Gudrun represent this ancient pair of goddesses who are at odds with each other. But there are also, Brynhild, notably, is a mythological figure, purely mythological. She's a Valkyrie, after all. And Gudrun seems to be more of a historical character, or at least a character who's purely realistic. And it indicates the two of them indicate two separate myth cycles that have been fused together, most likely. There are probably 4 or 5 different myths that have slowly accreted together in all of this. The Helgi Hundingsbane stories have been accreted to Sigmund, simply by making him the son, just as Tolkien suspects most likely the same thing happened with Sigurd. He became the son of Siegmund, or was mitotically split off from him. And so we got that myth cycle. So what we have are the myth cycles associated with Sigurd and Brynhilda, which was purely mythological. This is Tolkien's theory that he writes about in his brilliant book on the myth of Sigurd and Gudrun. And the historical aspect of the cycle, which is known as the Burgundians. The Burgundians are the Niflungs, the Nibelungs, also known as the Giukings, who are the Atli and Gunnar and Hogni and Gudorm. And they appear to be based on historical characters. Gunnar, for instance, is based on a historical character named Gundahari, who was the ruler of the Goths in the middle of the 5th century, at the time that Attila the Hun was invading. And long about 451, 452, there was a battle in the Catalonian plains in which Attila the Hun was victorious. He had already been victorious, or the Huns had been victorious in 437 against King Gundahari, and the Huns were victorious at this battle against the Goths. And it's possible then that the myth of Atli being at odds with Gunnar and the house of the Nibelungs may be recording a dim, the vestigial sort of echo of this myth cycle from the middle of the 5th century of the war between the Huns and the Goths. There's a very old tale called the Battle of the Huns and the Goths that exists in one of the Icelandic sagas that also may be a record of the defeat. After Attila dies in 453, the Huns lose their power against the Goths. And so we have in the myth two brothers, Angantyr and Hlod, and the two brothers go to war against each other. Hlod is the son of a Hunnish mother. He's half Gothic, half Hunnish, whereas Angantyr is pure Goth. And he slays his brother, kills him, and laments fate. Weird, the power of the Norns. And so what we have here in this myth cycle is the basic archetype, whereas Beowulf is an immunological character. I've already characterized him as a character who comes in, like Thor, and serves an immunological function to wipe a place clean of monsters or giants, as Thor did. Sigurd, on the other hand, is not that type of hero. Sigurd is he's a dragon slayer, but he's not immunological. He personifies this idea of the Germanic tribal conception of fate, that a great sort of naive, arrogant warrior hero at the height of his powers stumbles into the intermeshings of fate governed by the Norns, the power that's known as Wyrd, W-Y-R-D, and to which he absolutely has to submit. And he is pulled apart and drawn down into this abyss, just as with Brynhild, with Sigurd's crossing of Brynhild. She causes this cycle of events to be set in motion, which wipe up the whole house of the Nibelungs. Now, Tolkien points out that the Nibelungs are the same as the Burgundians in the myths, but there are some interesting things about this that indicate possibly that the Nibelungs were originally a race of dwarves, and that the original myth was actually that of Sigurd slaying, taking away a gold hoard from some dwarves, and the dwarves were the Nibelungs, and they were ascribed as being the dark elves who dwelled down below in the realm of rocks and caves. The dark elves are actually the dwarves. And he says it's an interesting fact that amongst the Burgundians, Hogni is the only one whose name does not alliterate as a G with everyone else. Grimhild, Gudrun, Gunnar, Godorm, they all have G's alliterating in their names except for Hogni. And in the Nibelungen line, Hogni is described not even as a brother, but as a vassal. So he's not even connected by blood in the Nibelungen line to this house. And he's described as having dark black hair. And Tolkien says the word Nebel in German means mist. And so the Nibelungs may be named after these beings who were associated with darkness and mist, and maybe the dark elves. And all of this material of these dark elves, dwarves who are smiths, who fashion all the weapons and instruments of the gods, somehow got transferred to the Burgundians. And Hogni is a sort of dim vestigial echo of this race of dwarves that got transferred to this historical house of the Burgundians that Sigurd stole the gold from, and then they contrived to do him in by tricking him, stealing his wife, stealing his life, stealing his treasure, taking everything away from him. Must have been the original myth. And so the two were fused together. The Sigurd myth cycle and the Burgundian cycle were fused together into the magnificent myth cycle that's described in the Volsunga saga and the Nibelungen line. Now, the Beowulf poet would not have known about most of this, since these are all later accretions and syntheses that take place around the 9th and 10th centuries. What he would have known about, however, is Siegmund and the dragon horde, killing the dragon, taking the horde, and the fact that the horde was cursed. And I think that's the key thing, the punchline. I know I've taken a long way around here to get to the punchline, but the punchline is that the Beowulf poet has enfolded the Siegmund mythos into his narrative, because the person, most of his audience would have known the Siegmund story, would have known that the gold hoard that he took from the dragon was cursed and would bring him only misfortune and bad luck. And so at first glance, it looks as though the poet is celebrating Beowulf, celebrating this magnificent deed where he's just killed Grendel, and tells the story of Siegmund as a foreshadowing of Beowulf's later magnificent deed of slaying the dragon. But in that case, as we find out, that gold hoard is cursed also and leads to the ruin of the Geatish people. The Geats, after the dragon is killed and Beowulf dies, no longer have a leader, and they're going to be absorbed by the Swedes. And so it brings ruin and misfortune on them. And so there's a subtle way in which I think the Beowulf poet very cleverly, by unfolding the myth of Siegmund slaying the dragon, and not telling you the outcome, because he knows that the audience knows the outcome, that the gold hoard is cursed and will bring about the ruin of his family, is also a subtle comment and foreshadowing, undermining the heroism of Beowulf's later deed, which appears at first glance to be a purely celebratory thing. But we know that the gold hoard is cursed and brings about the end of the Nibelungs, just as Beowulf's deed of slaying the dragon later at the end of the epic will bring about the end of the Geats. And so I think there's a subtle way in which he's undermining the heroic achievements of Beowulf. This guy was very clever, this poet. He really knew what he was doing. And so to finish up here with the Shop's comparison of Beowulf now to Heremod. Heremod was a bad king. He was the king who ruled as the proverbially corrupt king, who was a bad king prior to the arrival of Skjold-Skjefing. And so that led to the interregnum at which Skjold-Skjefing came in and saved the Danes. There's also an implied comparison, though, to Heremod as a bad king who failed the Danes, with Hrothgar, who has also failed the Danes here, note, because he was not able to get rid of Grendel and had to resort to a foreign power to do that for him. So there are subtle ways in which the myths that are recounted by the Shops in Beowulf, each myth has a complex set of commentaries and mirroring effects on the events of Beowulf itself. So none of the stories that he quotes are random at all. He says, so greatly had he prospered after Heremod's prowess, strength and daring had been brought to an end, when, battling with giants, he fell into the power of fiends and was at once done to death. He had long endured surging sorrows, had become a source of grief to his people and to all his retainers, and indeed in those times now almost forgotten, many wise men often mourned that great warrior, for they had looked to him to remedy their miseries. They thought that the prince's son would prosper and attain his father's rank, would protect his people, their heirlooms, and their citadel, the hero's kingdom, land of the Scyldings. Beowulf, Hugelac kinsman, was much loved by all who knew him, by his friends, but Heremod, by contrast, was stained by sin. And so he mentions the Heremod myth as a contrast, or the historical story as a contrast to Beowulf. That was a bad king, Heremod. He has recently just said that Hrothgar was a good king, although there's some irony in that, by contrast with Heremod, who was a bad king, but also failed the Danes in a way that suggests Hrothgar has failed the Danes. And the contrast with Beowulf, who's this apparently great man who is on his way up in the world. Just as Sigurd, prior to meeting Brynhild, was on his way up in the world and then meets Brynhild and has a reversal of fortune, which opens up an abyss that the Norns create that suck him down into it and wipe out the entire family of the Nibelungs. The Nibelungs and the Volsungs, both families are completely wiped out, just the same way that these two families here, the house that's associated with Hrothgar and the house that's associated with Hugelac, will also be wiped out in these events. So we'll leave it there before resuming with the next video.